Comrades and friends, on behalf of the Canadian Peace Congress, first of all, I want to begin by thanking the host organization for making the conference possible. And I also want to make sure that I extend our full solidarity of our organization to the peoples of Serbia and Montenegro, and to ensure you that we do not forget the brutal and criminal imperialist aggression against your country. As others have said, it's important that we're meeting to discuss the question of peace versus interventionism on the 15th anniversary of the 1999 NATO aggression, because many aspects of imperialism's current orientation were developed and tested and codified in the context of that aggression. And others have spoken rather completely to some of those features, so I'm not going to go there. The topic that I addressed in the paper I sent in was the doctrine of the responsibility to protect. And that's the legal pretext that provides moral cover for NATO's new strategic concept. This would be our proposal. The title of the paper I submitted is called Responsibility to Protect: Modern Imperialism's White Man's Burden. And that subtitle refers to a famous poem written by the British imperialist writer Rudyard Kipling called The White Man's Burden. Of course, it's racist. In that poem, he promoted aggressive and often brutal imperialist expansion under the pretext, the noble pretext, of humanitarian intervention. And this theme of humanitarian intervention, we can see it emerging in international relations in, for example, the early 19th century. And that was the context of competition among the major European powers for the territories that were the territories of the declining Ottoman Empire. They were competing to capture these territories. And humanitarian intervention, this notion, was used very effectively and very consistently by the imperialist countries to justify and to get support of their populations for these for wars of expansion. Now, to be effective for that purpose of expansion, humanitarian intervention had to be invoked in a sophisticated manner that could grasp hold of and hang on to public opinion. And part of this involved highlighting the supposed virtue of the imperialist country or the imperialist nation, and at the same time demonizing, absolutely demonizing, the character of the targeted state. And then positioning the war, the humanitarian intervention, as a moral obligation, a moral responsibility, a moral duty. So our argument here is that the doctrine of responsibility to protect, it emerges from an instrument that imperialism used in its past. They reached back and used this instrument, but they also changed it. It's a specific articulation of humanitarian intervention, and it involves a reinterpretation of international law relating to sovereignty, and some other speakers have mentioned this as well. In our view in the Canadian Peace Congress, responsibility to protect, or we shorten it, we just call it R2P. R2P is one of the biggest challenges facing the peace movement in Canada. I suspect it's a big challenge for many other countries as well. In a very short period of time, it's been proven to be a powerful instrument for imperialism, and one that's capable of neutralizing and even co-opting peace and anti-war forces in our country, for example. So as anti-imperialists, we have to expose responsibility to protect for what it really is. It's a pretext for aggression, intervention, war, occupation, and plunder. Full stop. That's what it was designed to do. That's what it's very effective at doing, and we have to oppose it. So the way, it's a complicated task, it's a big task, but how to approach it, it's useful to have some thoughts about how R2P and why it was developed. I'm sad to say that the government of my country, not my government, the government of my country in Canada, was a very strong promoter of the development of responsibility to protect. In the year 2000, the Canadian government sponsored the founding of the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, ICISS. And that was the body that was responsible for crafting up a legal justification for this new framework that imperialism used to intervene and expand. So as I said earlier, the idea of humanitarian intervention is not new, but there was always a problem. And Roland just spoke to this in a sense, which is that it constantly violated international law, constantly violated the principle of territorial integrity and state sovereignty, which is a key pillar, of course, of international law. It comes from the Peace of Westphalia hundreds of years ago. And so to address this problem, the ICISS was very clever. And I think there were a number of ways they addressed it. It's a large document, but there are three things that I want to point to that I think are important. First, they worked very hard to give the appearance that responsibility to protect was rooted in existing institutions of international law, and in fact is a logical evolution of those institutions. They worked very hard to present this and propagandize on this notion. The second thing they did was they very cleverly changed the notion of sovereignty. In their document, the ICISS report, they talk about state sovereignty not as a right to territorial integrity, but as a responsibility to protect us, for the responsibility of the state to protect its people. And then they equate the key obligations of sovereignty, they equate these directly with components of humanitarian and human rights law specifically. And then they say that if a state fails or is unable to guarantee those obligations, they forfeit their sovereignty. It's very explicit, and it's quite astonishing. It's a very broad reinterpretation, fundamental reinterpretation of this key aspect of international law. And the third thing that I want to speak about in terms of what the ICISS did is they projected specific mechanisms and bodies that could quickly spread propaganda about the perpetration of atrocities. Whether they're true or not isn't important. They use these bodies to present the appearance of confirmation, the appearance of verification, and they spread the propaganda in such a way that it very clearly assigned blame to the target state, meaning it excused all of the provocation and the backdrop that we all very well understand. And the ICISS goes further and points to specific bodies that it finds were very reliable in the service of imperialism. What were they? It mentions the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. It mentions the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. It mentions the International Criminal Court and many other it also mentions numerous non-government organizations whose work and structure are completely outside of the UN, the influence and the monitoring of the United Nations. And it downplays the role of UN mechanisms in this process. So it talks about show trials. So largely on the basis of the ICISS report, the doctrine of responsibility to protect was codified, not as a law, but as a norm. And it's a norm, an international norm that's used to interpret and apply international law. So it's not the only pretext that imperialism uses to justify aggressions, for sure. But it's one that's been very, very effective. It's been used sometimes on its own and sometimes in conjunction with other pretexts to justify aggression against Yugoslavia, against Afghanistan, against Iraq, Haiti, Mali, Syria, and also in the current provocations against Iran, Ukraine, and the DPRK. We see it used all the time. And why is it used? Because it's effective at neutralizing, confusing and neutralizing opposition. Part of its strength, a big part of its strength, is that it appeals to and plays upon basic human concerns. We don't like to see fellow human beings suffer tragedies of war and repression and poverty. We don't like that. That's why we're all here. And we feel the need to do something to assist. And there are many people in my country and in many other countries who view humanitarian intervention as a concrete vehicle for providing that necessary assistance. They've been told that this works, they've been confused, and people have spoken to the media manipulation of public thinking. And as a result, they become supportive of responsibility to protect and they become supportive or to some extent agreeable to the resulting military intervention. So this is why we say that responsibility to protect really is the modern imperialism's white man's burden, thinking back to the poem by Rudyard Kipling. So the theme of the session for today was democratization of international relations. Of course, this is a massive topic. The challenge to do that is enormous, but it's also urgent. And I think as peace and anti-imperialist activists, there are some contributions that we can make to that. So to begin, I think that democratizing international relations requires that we confront and tear down those institutions which serve the interests of imperialism and prevent democracy in international relations. And that means that we have to very clearly oppose the doctrine of responsibility to protect. When people suggest that R2P can be changed, that it can be reformed, that there's some good aspect to it, that there's a principle in there that's worth keeping, we need to say no. No. R2P is an imperialist instrument. It was designed for specific reasons to justify expansion, to justify division and redivision of the world. And it works. It's working for that purpose. And we shouldn't pretend that it can be turned into any other purpose. We need to get rid of it. That means we need a clear assessment of the main dangers to peace at any particular moment. And we need to be able to project concrete basis of unity for building mass opposition to instruments like responsibility to protect. We need to attack and deconstruct the justification that the ICISS provided for responsibility to protect. And that means, and it's a challenge, but it means that we have to strengthen our understanding of sovereignty, what it means. And we need to be able to justify that principle in the face of disinformation, in the face of propaganda that is cloaked in the language of humanitarianism. We need to equip ourselves internationally and in our own countries individually to be able to confront that and tear it apart and expose it for what it really is. It means we have to expose the nature of the various tribunals and the show trials and other international bodies that imperialism uses, and instead we need to reassert the transparent and democratic and accountable international forum. And that means the United Nations. It's imperfect, it's been weakened, it's been distorted, and people have spoken to that. But it's still, that forum needs to be, we need to be able to speak to that and point to it as that's the place where international relations need to be interpreted and discussed, not through some separate ad hoc body that's been set up by and in the interests of imperialist states and purposes. I'm almost finished, comrade. We need to shift public discussion away from debating the pretexts that R2P offers and instead have a discussion about the real reason for aggressions and war. That's the division and redivision of the world. And of course, we have to continue to oppose NATO and redouble our efforts to withdraw from and dissolve that organization, which from its very beginnings was and continues to be criminal, aggressive, illegal, and imperialist. We should not brook any conversation that talks about saving NATO or reforming it. We need to just dissolve that organization and withdraw from it. So this is not an easy task, but the choice before the peoples of the world really is, as the conference is called, global peace versus global interventionism and imperialism. And among the most deeply held human convictions of the world's peoples is the desire for peace. They will continue to demand it, whatever the circumstances, and they will achieve it. Thank you very much.